Hey everyone, hope you guys are enjoying Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak in whichever platform you're choosing to play it on. And today what I wanted to do is have a little bit of a discussion topic with you guys regarding the Fated 4. Maybe this is a term that a lot of people have not necessarily heard, but I know a lot of old classic Monster Hunter players have heard of these 4 monsters. And in this video I want to kind of talk about their potential return into the fold, as all 4 monsters finally appearing in the game together once again since Generations and Generations Ultimate. Essentially what I'm talking about here is Capcom potentially bringing them all together for the next mainline entry, and would that be something that players would want to see? So let me know in the comments if that is something that you would like Capcom to do, as I always feel like having these type of discussion topics fosters one of those developer ideas where they essentially hear enough of the community raving and wanting for something that they eventually make it happen. And Capcom has been pretty good as of late, listening to player feedback to essentially get things done. So for those who may not necessarily know the story of the Fated 4, these are the 4 monsters, Gameth, Glavenus, Mitsune, and Astalos, that were originally introduced as the flagship monsters in Monster Hunter Generations on the Nintendo 3DS all the way back in 2015. Now remember, Generations received the Ultimate update on the 3DS, and eventually it was ported to the Nintendo Switch. It was the very first Nintendo Switch Monster Hunter game that we got. It was a port of the 3DS game, but by then, you know, other monsters had become the flagship at that point. And essentially what we ended up seeing is that while neither one of these monsters were like specifically tied to one another, it's not like what Capcom tried to do with like Sunbreak, for example, with the 3 lords, where you know, you have Malzeno, you have Garangom, and you have Lunagaron, essentially being monsters that the kingdom kind of revered for one way or another. The Fated 4 were not necessarily monsters tied to one another lore-wise. They were just monsters that protected specific areas in the map, and they were like separate from each other. They never really came to cross paths or anything like that, apparently, with the story. So you had Astalos covering a certain part of the jungle, you had Glavenus covering the other end of it, Mitsune covering the rapids and a different forest, and then Gameth covering pretty much the icy area. And they had their very own reasons for being what they were, and at the end of the day, they were just the flagship monsters for Generations. And what ended up happening was that in subsequent games, we never really got to see them again. This is something that I would imagine Capcom would want to rectify for the next mainline entry. Now remember that Glavenus was reintroduced in Iceborne. It was the first one to return. It was probably the more fan favorite one, realistically speaking, since, you know, it was one of those really popular ones even back at Generations time of release. I probably ended up being, probably because of the armor set, I would say. The weapons certainly had this really unique look to them. So Glavenus ended up being the most popular one. So they definitely decided to bring it back for Iceborne. It wasn't part of base Monster Hunter World. However, a lot of people would argue that Glavenus was just simply a very different fight, a very different beast, and they kind of ruined it, is what the sentiment has been online. That Capcom ruined Glavenus, and it wasn't necessarily the fight that people wanted it to be. And at the end of the day, you know, they kind of left it as is. They never really adjusted it. Now, of course, for base Monster Hunter Rise, we did end up seeing the introduction of Mitsune, and you know, it was the second of the Fated 4 making its way to a new game. But, you know, it was just what it was. It was just another typical fight. Ultimately, we ended up getting Violet Mitsune, another variant for it, but of course, it is what it is. It wasn't necessarily anything too out of the ordinary to see it get a variant, you know, outside of the norm. And of course, Astalos ended up getting introduced later on for Sunbreak. So it was one of those things where, like, now, you know, Astalos, and sadly, you know, a Dread King, I believe is what it's called, the subspecies or the variant, that we didn't necessarily end up seeing, but, you know, Astalos ended up getting, you know, his own version added in to Sunbreak. So we have seen now, at the very least, a return of 3 of the monsters, 2 of which have had, you know, some changes, with Mitsune getting a variant, and Glavenus back in Iceborne getting a, you know, complete rework. Astalos, I think, would be the only one that's kind of remained the same. It hasn't necessarily been changed all that much. So, it's still relatively, close to what the original fight was back on the 3DS. And it hasn't necessarily been reworked at all in any of his latest iterations. Well, what that leaves is essentially Gammoth, the big elephant, the icy elephant. And the thing is that this monster, probably the reintroduction of it, is kind of like Leggy, for that matter. It's one of those things where, like, because of its sheer size, because of just how massive it is, it does seem to have some skeletal issues with the way that it would most likely end up being implemented in whatever the latest entry is. It was always deemed to be one of those slower type of monsters. It has a lot of snow effects in its own right, and it's certainly, if it didn't make its way into Iceborne, which was, let's say, one of the more heavy ice themed, content drops that we ended up seeing for Monster Hunter, at the very least, latest Monster Hunter games, if we didn't see it kind of make its way into that version of the game, or at the very least in that game, it wouldn't necessarily have made a lot of sense for them to go ahead and drop it into Rise and their Sunbreak, since, there was just so many fire monsters being added in. They decided to go a different route with that. So Gammoth, there's most likely a skeletal reason as to why we haven't necessarily seen it come back, but this is why I wanted to have that discussion. Maybe for, again, Monster Hunter 6, Monster Hunter Paradise. Again, people hate the word paradise, but there's multiple places where that name came from. It wasn't just the Discord leak, there was other places as well. So ratings boards listings, for example. So at the end of the day, there's more to it than just the Discord rumors. And it does make me wonder if the Fated 4 coming back, maybe the 3 Lords coming back in the next mainline game, whether it's 6, Paradise, whatever, World 2, would be something that Capcom would want to chase after. They are fan favorite monsters at the end of the day. At the very least, 2 of them are. Glavenus and Mitsune certainly are fan favorite monsters. Whether Astalos fulfills that criteria, and Gammoth, we just really haven't seen it other than, again, the original 3DS games and the port on the Nintendo Switch for Generations Ultimate. So it's really hard to say if, that is a fan favorite monster like the other 3. Probably not, only because we haven't necessarily seen it in other recent entries. So people haven't necessarily been exposed to it as much as the other monsters, but it does make me wonder, just something that Capcom would want to do, bring them back and put them in the forefront. Maybe not flagships. We know that they're not necessarily going to repeat flagship monsters from one game to another, but maybe put them in the forefront as something that players should be happy to see. But I certainly do want to hear your guys' feedback on this. Would you like to see the Fated 4 make a comeback, and in what way and in what entry? If you're brand new to my channel, though, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.